All right, for this section, we're going to be going over atrioventricular blocks. It's chapter 7 in your ECG Made Easy book. For the practice rhythms in the back of the chapter, we're only going to be discussing the heart block rhythms for time purposes, but there are a lot of other review rhythms here that associate with the previous chapters in the book. I did want to share a poem with you before we get started, and it's just a poem that makes it a little easier to remember your heart blocks. And you can Google this poem. If you just Google heart block poem, it'll come right up. If the R is far from P, then you have a first degree. Longer, longer, longer drop, then you have a winky block. If some P's don't get through, then you have a Mobitz 2. If P's and Q's don't agree, then you have a third degree. So we'll be applying this poem to some of the rhythms in this chapter, and it'll help you figure out some of these heart blocks. So first rhythm we're going to look at, and if you just glance at this right away, it looks like a sinus tachycardia. I do have a regular rhythm. I have P waves for every QRS complex, and I have T waves and I have narrow QRS complexes. And I do have one P wave for every QRS complex, so I have a regular conduction ratio. What separates it out from being a sinus tachycardia is this PR interval. So if I measure from the beginning of my P wave to the beginning of the QRS complex, I actually have 6 small blocks there, which is pretty far. So definitely over that normal, 2 block, or sorry, 0.12 to 0.2 seconds. I get 0.24 seconds here for my PR interval. So there's some kind of block that's slowing down the conduction through the AV node, and we call that a first degree. So thinking back to our poem, if the P is far from R, then you have a first degree. So for my interpretation, I have sinus tach at 110 beats per minute. I do put an underlying rhythm with this one, just because it is really a sinus rhythm. It's just that our PR interval is longer. So sinus tach at 110 beats per minute with a first degree AV block. You can also write this first degree heart block, however you prefer to write that. Moving on to the second page, we're going to be looking at all 3 rhythms on this page. I'm going to slide this over so you can see my whole interpretation. So the first one I'm looking at up here is number 25, or figure 7.15. I want to look at my rhythm. Is it regular? It is regular, definitely slow. Remember, we're looking at the ventricular rate here because that is what conducts that mechanical pulse. It's definitely easier to see up here in lead 2. So if we look up here in lead 2, my rate I got 30. So 1, 2, 3 times 10 gave me that 30 beats per minute. I do have P waves. They are upright, but if you look at my conduction ratio, it's a little different. So I'm going to highlight all my P waves here. And you can see that I have 2 P waves for every QRS complex. Now, it's important to note that when a P wave does get through, my PR interval remains consistent. So there is still some relationship between the P's and the Q's. It's just that not all P waves are getting all the way through to the ventricle. So it is really important to note that for a second degree type 2 classic AV block, your PR interval, when you have a QRS that follows the P wave, your PR interval will always remain consistent. If some P's don't get through, then you have a Mobitz 2. So we are going to call this a second degree type 2 or classic AV block. We can also label a second degree type 2 Mobitz 2 AV block, depending on what text you read. At 30 beats per minute, with a 2-to-1 conduction ratio. And a lot of times I just write 2-to-1, and it's kind of given that that is the conduction ratio. But we definitely want to put a conduction ratio with our second degree type 2 classic heart blocks. It's the only heart block that we put a conduction ratio because it's the only one where we might have multiple P waves for a QRS complex on a normal consistent basis. Going down to number 26, my rhythm. It is regular. My rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. times 10 gave me that 50 beats per minute. Now my P waves are kind of all over the place. Got one buried in there. So P waves, they vary. Sometimes I have 3 for one, sometimes I have 2 for one QRS complex. It just depends on the rate. My PR interval then varies. My QRSs are narrow. I just wanted to note that, and I do have some ST elevation here, which is very easy to see. Now, this is going to be a complete heart block, and we will go through the process of elimination to see how we get there. So it definitely can't be a first degree. I don't have that weird PR interval. Okay, so it's all over the place. It's not just long. For second degree type 1 or winky back, longer drop, then you have a winky back. It definitely can't be a second degree type 1 because it's a regular rhythm. And when we look at a winky back, you'll see how that rhythm is always going to be irregular. For second degree type 2 or a classic heart block, we can rule that one out because when I do have a QRS for a P wave, my PR interval is definitely not consistent. It's very short here, a little longer here, definitely longer here, very short there. So it's always changing. Now, we do want to see, do I have a relationship between my P's and my Q's? So sometimes we can't see all these P waves because they're buried in the QRS complex. We would just mark where they would be, and you can see that they actually measure out. My PP interval is always consistent. So if I had one here, it would measure there. So my P's are very consistent, and then my RRs are consistent. They're just on 2 totally different paths. So my atria is beating at a regular rate, and my ventricles are beating at a regular rate. There's just no connection, no communication between the atria and the ventricle. So we call it a complete heart block. If the P's and Q's don't agree, then you have a third degree. So I have third degree heart block, third degree AV block or complete heart block, if you want to label it that, at 50 beats per minute. Again, you can either label it the AV block or you can label it the heart block. It does not matter. All right, moving down to the third rhythm on this page, I'm looking at number 27 or figure 7.17. My rhythm is irregular, so we can see very irregular there. For my rate, remember we're counting the ventricular rate. 1, 2, 3, 4 times 10 gave me that 40 beats per minute. For my P waves, they vary. So I kind of marked down here, I have 1 P wave for this QRS complex. I have 1 here, I have 3 here, and 1 here. When I do have a PR interval, it is consistent. This PR interval is the same as this PR interval, same as this PR interval, and this one is also the same. So I do have a consistent PR interval when I have a QRS that follows a P wave. For my QRS, I just put that it was wide, and we can tell just by looking at that. And because it's wide, we're not going to mark that ST depression because we know it's just because that is coming from the ventricle, so it's going to look different. So we can go through the process of elimination again. It's the best way to really start when you start learning heart blocks. Go through and just start canceling out heart blocks that it can't be. So it can't be a first degree because my PR interval is actually pretty normal here. It's very same. Winky back, longer drop. Then you have a winky back, which is my second degree type 1. Can't be that because my PR interval is the same. Could it be a second degree type 2? I do have some more P waves than I do QRS complexes, but I have very consistent PRI. Sometimes our second degree type 2 can be irregular. It's one of those that could be regular or irregular, just depends on the conduction ratio. And we could always cancel out third degree because my RR is not regular. So the RR would have to be regular for it to be a third degree because my ventricles would be on their own doing their own thing at a very regular rate. So it cannot be a third degree. So this is in fact a second degree. So I have second degree type 2, which is also called classic AV block, with a variable conduction ratio because I do have different P waves, amount of P waves per QRS complex depending on what complex you're looking at. And if we think back to our poem, if we have more P's than Q's, then we have a Mobitz 2. So remember, type 2 would also be called type 2 would also be called a Mobitz 2. So it's just another name for type 2, but I do have more P's than Q's, so it also fits with our poem. All right, we're going to be looking at all three rhythms on this page. So I'm looking at number 28, figure 7.18. Regular or irregular? Definitely irregular. My rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 10 gave me that 50 beats per minute. My P waves, yes, I do have P waves for every QRS complex, and I'll highlight them here. And now our PR interval, it varies. So I just measured out these last three so you could see the difference in PR intervals. Here I had 5 blocks, and the next PR interval was 8 blocks. And then for this last one, I got 9 to 10. I think I ended up rounding it to 10 blocks. So my PR interval is getting longer. My QRSs, I just put narrow, and I do have some ST segment depression that we do want to note. So, first degree heart block. Can it be a first degree? Well, we can block that out because this is a normal PR interval, so it definitely couldn't be a first degree. Also, first degrees are typically regular, and this is irregular. Second degree type 1 or winky Bach. Longer drop, then you have a winky Bach. So it does fit with that longer. And what we're looking at on this side is we do have that dropped beat. Okay, so we had a long PR interval and a P wave with no QRS that followed. That is the dropped beat. Now, just to cancel out the other types, we'll look at second degree type 2 or our classic heart block. Do we have more P's than Q's? Yes, we do. But is our PR interval consistent? It is not. So we cannot call this a second degree type 2. And then we can't call it a third degree because our RR's intervals are not regular. So it has to be a second degree type 1 winky Bach at 50 beats per minute. Number 29, this rhythm is very small, so hopefully you have your book, you can follow along. This is figure 7.19. My rhythm is definitely irregular. I have a huge area here where I don't have any ventricular conduction at all. For my rate, I put 50 because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My P waves, I do have P waves throughout here, but I do have them before the QRS complexes. There is one P wave for every QRS complex. My PR interval varies. So I did measure out the PR interval over here. For this first complex, my PR interval is 3 blocks. For the second complex, my PR interval is 4 blocks. And then for my third complex, my PR interval is 6 blocks. And as we talked about before with the rhythm above, that is indicative of a winky Bach. So longer drop, then you have a winky Bach. Oh, and I definitely labeled that wrong. So this is a second degree type 1 winky block, AV block. It transitions into something called a ventricular standstill. So from here to here, we have no ventricular conduction at all. So we call it a ventricular standstill, meaning my ventriculars are just doing nothing. It's a type of asystole, so they will actually not produce a mechanical pulse during that time. All right, going down to number 30, figure 7.20. Regular or irregular? This is definitely irregular because of this beat right here seems to come early. For my rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 times 10, gave me that 40 beats per minute. For my P waves, I put some because I have a P wave for this one, I have a P wave for this complex, no P wave here, and a P wave for this complex. Now my PR interval, very long here. It's 9 blocks long, so 9 times 0.04 seconds gave me that 0.36 seconds for my PR interval. My QRSs are narrow, and my ST segment is normal. So, my PR interval is consistent, except for this beat because we don't have a P wave. They are all 0.36 seconds. So our underlying rhythm, let's think about, If my P is far from Q, then I have a first degree. So this is definitely a first degree heart block with that huge PR interval. And what we have going on here is this beat does seem to come early. It has no P wave, so that's actually a PJC, premature junctional complex. So thinking back to our junctional rhythms, because that lack of P wave. And what's happening here is probably that this rhythm is so slow that the AV node's thinking like, oh my gosh, the SA node's not firing correctly. I need to get a beat off to help, keep that pulse up. So it's just really conduction system falling back on that AV node to try to speed up the pulse of this patient. So sinus Brady at 40 beats per minute with a first degree AV block. It is sinus because we do have one P wave for every QRS complex, and the only thing that does not measure normally is that long PR interval with one PJC. All right, moving on to the next page, I'm looking at number 32 or figure 7.22. My rhythm, it is regular. So we can already eliminate my second degree type 1, my winky back, because winky backs are irregular because we have that dropped beat. My rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, which gave me 40 beats per minute. And then my P waves, I have 2 P waves for every QRS complex. My PR interval, when I do have QRS that follows the P, is consistent. My QRS is narrow, it falls right on the line of that 0.12 seconds, and then my ST segment, if we look at that isoelectric line, my QRS ends here, it is 2 blocks above, so I do have some ST elevation going on there. So could it be a first degree? No, because I have multiple P waves for every QRS complex. Could it be a second degree type 1 winky back? No, my PR interval stays very consistent, so I don't have that longer PR interval and then a dropped beat. Could it be a second degree type 2? Yes, because my P, I have multiple P's per Q, and when I do have a QRS complex follow a P wave, that PR interval is consistent. So there is still a relationship between the atria and the ventricle. It's just not every conduction is getting through to the ventricles. And for this one, it happens to be in a nice pattern. I have a 2-to-1 conduction ratio. It cannot be a third degree heart block because I still have that consistent PR interval. So there still is some communication between the atria and the ventricle. It's just not happening with every beat. So interpretation is a second degree type 2 or second degree Mobitz type 2 classic heart block at 40 beats per minute with a 2-to-1 conduction ratio. Make sure you put that in there, and ST segment elevation. If it is a consistent conduction ratio, the rhythm is going to be regular. If it's a variable conduction ratio, the rhythm will be irregular. So it's important to put that conduction ratio in there. If we look down at the second one, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it looks very similar to this one up here. I have 2 P waves for every QRS complex. My PR interval is always consistent when a QRS follows the P wave. So there is still some communication between the atria and ventricle. That excludes it from being a third degree. It cannot be a third degree heart block. Even though my PPs measure out and my RRs measure out, because that PR interval is so consistent, meaning there's still communication between the atria and ventricle, we are not going to call that a third degree heart block. And then I definitely have some ST elevation going on here. So my interpretation is going to be a second degree type 2 classic AV block, classic heart block, with a 2-to-1 conduction ratio and ST elevation. And I'm sorry, I should have put my rate in there, which would be 60 beats per minute. All right, let's look at the first rhythm on this page. So I'm looking at number 34, or figure 7.24. My rhythm is regular, so that it automatically excludes my winky back, because winky backs are irregular. My rate, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times 10 gave me that 90 beats per minute. I do have one P wave for every QRS complex. They are all upright and they are all normal. And what makes this not a typical sinus rhythm is that my PR interval is 0.28 seconds. So it's about 7 blocks long, and I measured it out here, so you can see that. So I have that long PR interval. So that's indicative of a first degree heart block. So I did put some ST depression here, but I don't really think it's enough to say anything about, so I'm actually going to leave that out of my interpretation. So my interpretation is going to be sinus rhythm with a first degree AV block, for first degree heart block, at 90 beats per minute. I'm going to take a look at number 35, figure 7.25. My rhythm is regular. So again, excludes that first degree second degree type 1. My rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 10, gave me that 50 beats per minute. My P waves, I'll highlight them, they're very tiny, but they are there. I have some that are buried in these T waves here too, in the QRS complexes. But it varies. So some I have 3, some I have 2. It just, depending on the rate, the number of P waves, my conduction ratio definitely varies. My PR interval also varies. So you can see here I have a very long PR interval. I have a longer one here, then a very short one here, a long one here. So it's all over the place. My QRSs are narrow and my ST segment's normal. So let's go through our process of elimination. Can it be a first degree? No. I have more P's than I have QRS complexes, so that cancels out first degree. Could it be a second degree type 1? No, because it is regular. My rate is regular, and also I don't have that longer drop. My PR interval is just kind of all over the place. Could it be a second degree type 2? Well, I do have more P's than Q's, however, there is no relationship between these P waves and these QRS complexes because my PR interval is not consistent when I have a QRS that follows the P wave. So it cannot be a second degree type 2. It is in fact a third degree. So obviously my RRs march out and my PPs will march out, just some of them are hidden in some of these complexes. So you can see the P waves that are highlighted march out. So my atria is going at so many beats per minute, my ventricle is going at so many beats per minute. There's just no communication between the two. So this is a third degree AV block or a complete heart block at 50 beats per minute. Looking at the next page, we're only going to look at the first rhythm up here. This is number 37, or figure 7.27. My rhythm is regular. So again, we're going to cancel out that second degree type 1, that winky back. My rate, I have 40. 1, 2, 3, 4 times 10 gave me that 40 beats per minute. I do have P waves. They are all upright. They all are uniform, but I have 2 P waves for every QRS complex. My PR interval, when I have a PR interval, is consistent. So this PR interval, they all look the same length. My QRS I've marked as wide, and because it's a wide, we're not really going to look at the ST elevation. So my interpretation is the second degree type 2 classic AV block at 40 beats per minute with a 2-to-1 conduction ratio. And this could not be a third degree heart block because my PR interval, when I have a PR interval, is always consistent. It always remains the same. All right, looking at the next page, looking at number 41, or figure 7.31. My rhythm is overall irregular, but when I look at each rhythm, they are regular. For my rate, I had to measure out. I just measured out my sinus over here. This one was actually very close. So I got 15 blocks across, which gave me 1500 divided by 15, gave me 100 beats per minute. This was actually only 9 blocks apart, so I didn't even put a second rate because they're very close in rate. For my P waves, obviously the second half is ventricular rhythm because it's very wide, but just looking at the first part, I do have P waves for every QRS complex. They are very tall, but they are uniform. They are all upright. I have one for each QRS complex, and they all do look the same. My PR interval, however, and I marked it down here, is 6 blocks long. So I get 0.24 seconds. So it's definitely long. So I have a long PR interval, which is already making me think first degree heart block. My QRS, I start off narrow, and then it goes into a wide ventricular tachycardia. This is VT. My ST segment is normal on my sinus side. So my interpretation, I have a sinus rhythm at 100 beats per minute with a first degree AV block because I have such a long PR interval that transfers into a ventricular tachycardia. All right, looking down here, figure 7.32 or number 42. My rhythm, it is irregular. Look at the space between these two, and then it goes back, speeds up a little bit. So definitely irregular for my rhythm. For my rate of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 10 gave me that 50 beats per minute. For my P waves, I do have P waves. I'll highlight them. They're small, but they're there. And my PR interval varies. My QRSs are narrow, and my ST segment looks normal. So let's look at my PR intervals here. Can it be a first degree? No, because I do have some short PR intervals here, so it cannot be first degree. Also, it's not regular. Now, just marking out my PR intervals. And then I have a beat that dropped. So we can definitely see that my PR intervals are getting longer, and then I have a dropped beat right here. So this one, after this, I'd probably have a dropped beat over here. So longer, longer, longer drop, then you have a winky back. So it fits right in with my poem. Couldn't be a first degree because we do have a normal PR interval. Could not be a second degree type 2 classic because my PR interval is not consistent. Even though I have more P's here than I do Q's, my PR interval is not consistent. This is just that dropped beat. And it can't be a third degree because my RR is not regular. So we can cancel that one out too. So this is a second degree type 1 winky back or a second degree Mobitz 1 heart block at 50 beats per minute. All right, we're just going to be looking at the last rhythm on this page. I'm going to slide it over so you can see my full interpretation. But this is number 45 or figure 7.35. Rhythm is irregular. So you can see it's definitely not regular here. My rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 times 10 gave me 40 beats per minute. My P waves, they are all upright. I do have P waves for every QRS complex, and I'm going to highlight them. Just a different amount of P waves. We may even have a P wave right here in that T wave. My PR interval, so when I do have a QRS complex that follows that P wave, my PR interval is consistent. So we can see here with these P waves, my PR interval does not change. My QRS is narrow. I measured it out over here, and I do have some ST segment depression. So could this be a first degree? No. My PR interval is very short. Could this be a second degree type 1? No, my PR interval does not get longer drop. Could it be a second degree type 2? I do have more P's than Q's, and my PR interval does remain consistent when I have a QRS that follows. I just have a variable conduction ratio because sometimes I have 2 P waves, 1 P wave, 2 here, so it's just a variable conduction ratio. So there is still a relationship between my P waves and my QRS complexes. It's just not every P wave is getting through, not every sinoatrial node contraction is getting through to the ventricles. But there is still a relationship when they are getting through. Could it be a third degree? No, because my RR is not regular. With a third degree, my PP would be regular and my RR would be regular. And we can see here it's definitely not. So this has to be a second degree type 2 or second degree Mobitz 2 classic heart block or AV block at 40 beats per minute with a variable conduction ratio because we have different amounts of P's for QRS complexes. Right, on the next page, again, we're going to be looking at that last rhythm. It's number 48, or figure 7.38. I'm going to slide this over so we can see my whole rhythm interpretation. I have some things highlighted already here, so we'll go through it. My rhythm is regular, so that already cancels out a second degree type 1 Winky Bach. My rate is 40, 1, 2, 3, 4 times 10, give me that 40 beats per minute. My P waves, it varies, so I have highlighted my P waves, and you can see that sometimes I have 1 P wave, sometimes I have 2 P waves. It just depends on what section we're looking at. So just thinking about what we have so far, it can't be a first degree. I have a short PR interval here. It can't be a second degree type 1 Winky Bach. I don't have that longer drop. Here I have a short, a really long, and then a medium, and it's regular, so it cannot be a Winky Bach. Thinking about a second degree type 2, I do have more P's than Q's, however, there is no relationship here. If it was going to be a second degree type 2, my PR interval would be consistent when I did have a QRS that followed a P wave, so it cannot be a second degree type 2. So that leaves us with a third degree complete AV block at 40 beats per minute. And then I did note that ST segment depression, so here's the isoelectric line, and I have inverted T waves here. So some extra things to note. And if you do look, obviously our RRs march out, but our PPs will also march out. So you just use your scrap paper. You can see that the PPs do march out. And I circled here, there's probably a P wave hidden in that T wave, so I just marked where it would be by putting a circle and line my paper up, and it marches out right with the next P wave. So this is a third degree complete AV block at 40 beats per minute. All right, we're just going to be looking at the top rhythm here. Number 49, figure 7.39, regular or irregular. It is regular. My rate is 50 beats per minute. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 10 gave me that 50 beats per minute. And then I highlighted my P waves so you could see them here if you didn't have the book and you were just trying to follow along with the video. And I have 2 P waves for every QRS complex. My QRS is narrow. My PR interval is consistent when I have a QRS that follows a P wave. So that PR interval is consistent. And that makes this a second degree type 2 classic AV block at 50 beats per minute with a 2-to-1 conduction ratio. And finally here we have our last page. And you can see my poem written there. I'm looking at number 53, or figure 7.43. My rhythm is regular. My rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 times 10 give me that 40 beats per minute. My P waves, I highlighted them up here. I'm not even going to look at this bottom part. It's easiest to see in lead 2, so we're not even going to look at that last part. You can see I have 2 P waves for every QRS complex. They are all upright, they're all uniform, so remember I have that 2-to-1 conduction ratio there. My PR interval is consistent when I do have a P wave that follows, a QRS that follows a P wave, so I've marked those out here and you can see that it's very consistent. So, process of elimination. If the R is far from P, then you have a first degree. Well, it is far from P, but I also have some P waves that don't have any R's that follow, so it cannot be a first degree. Longer drop, then you have a Winky Bach. Doesn't get longer at all, so can't be a Winky Bach, plus it have a very regular rhythm. If some P's don't get through, then you have a Mobitz 2. I definitely have some P's that are not getting through here. And further confirming that it's Mobitz 2 is that I have that consistent PR interval. So there is still some communication between the P waves and the QRS complexes. It's just not getting through every time. So we can stop right there and label this as second degree type 2 classic AV block at 40 beats per minute with a 2-to-1 conduction ratio. Even though my PPs march out and my RRs march out, it cannot be a third degree heart block because there is still some communication between the atria and the ventricle, because I do have that signal getting through every once in a while and creating that very consistent PR interval.